Witam Państwa serdecznie, Błażej Hrabkowicz, to jest festiwal EnergaCAMERIMAGE w Toruniu, and our guest is director Alfonso Cuarón. Hello.
Hello.
How are you? Everything
I'm
okay?
very good, thank you.
When I think about many of your films, and I think about, for example, Little Princess, Great Expectations, Roma, Children of Man, and even Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, there is this theme of social divide, class divide, or social upheaval. It keeps returning, I feel, in your work, in your films. Do you feel particularly drawn to that theme? Are you interested in it as a filmmaker?
I was never really aware of that until people talk about it. I guess that for filmmakers, you just do what you feel is the right thing. And then inevitably, I guess, things that intrigue you personally, they just leak into the work, or they inform the work. I always say it's like asking Guillermo del Toro about clocks, or about clock mechanism, or about tunnels. All of his films, they have clocks and tunnels.
Yeah.
I don't think that he's thinking about clocks and tunnels all the time.
Yeah.
Maybe he does. But it's, I guess that like, as in life and everything, is very clear that there is, in terms of human relationships, there's a certain divide, that artificial divide, that is social class.
Mm-hmm. And I'm asking because it is a very cinematic theme. I mean, it's a great material for a filmmaker, I guess, to actually take the theme and convey some observations about modern world. So maybe this is a useful tool in a way, a storytelling tool.
Well, I guess so. I mean, now that you mention it, the class divide, I mean, is very Dickensian. Dickens books, most of them. But British literature, I guess, is like that because there's no country with a class divide as strong.
Sure.
Maybe India and the United Kingdom, that are the most class segregated countries that exist in the world, but where there's not much fluidity between the classes. But I think that it's clear that in literature is very well represented. That ever since painting stopped being like a painting that was not like commissioned by the upper classes, you can see the representation of a greater representation of class. You can see it in the work of Bruegel, or later on after the Impressionists, that they started marking more that difference.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you about your process a little bit. Do you prepare in terms of when you are in pre-production? Do you prepare the visual style of film very precisely? Do you compose it? Do you storyboard it? Or are you more of a filmmaker that, of course, does pre-production, but then allows things to come up during the shoot?
The first thing that comes to me when I'm thinking of a film pretty much is the form, the language that inspires me to do something. The approach, the cinematic approach. That comes usually together with the story, maybe even before the story. Mm-hmm. And then I guess that the process that varies. In the old days, in my early days, I used to storyboard a lot. More than anything because I was very insecure about, of not doing the things right. Mm. Eventually, I started freeing myself from that because I started learning that I like staging. I have an idea in my head. I have more or less a visual in my head of how, but I want to be informed as well as by reality. And sometimes allowing, and I started learning more and more that the best thing that can happen to you is a happy accident, something that you could have not planned. And that is one of those miracles that life just delivers. But still, even if I try to be loose like that, there are certain scenes that definitely I storyboard just because they inform, not only for me, because maybe I'm clear more or less what I want to do, but the storyboard would inform the other crew members of what you're doing, in certain specific scenes.
I'm asking because you mentioned staging, that you enjoy staging, and I see that in your films that they are told primarily, in my view, through visual tools like staging, like blocking, like frame composition. This for me is something, for example, the Children of Man, this famous tracking shot, I think it tells much more than you could have told with words. And for me, this is like pure cinema. So I guess what you're saying is that this is like using the language of cinema, like telling something through staging rather than through talking.
Well, I try to do that as much as possible, just because that's how I understand cinema. Since I was a kid, what I was drawn to was precisely that, something that's very intangible. That is what I love about, and you enter the more abstract aspect of cinema, in which is, again, not about words or necessarily a message or a story, but it's just the combination of the visual, of the camera work inside the frame, and how the elements in that geography are spread, in that space, and how they flow in time, And by the way, and that's also what I'm drawn sometimes at doing one-shot deals. But by the same token, cutting is another kind of method of achieving a similar thing, or a different thing, but it's part of the combination of all those elements. At the end, what is cinema but cinematography and editing?
Sure. Yeah, I mentioned this tracking shot in Children of Men, but actually tracking shots, long shots, master shots are something that is, I think, very common in your films. And for me, when I see tracking shots, master shots, they can be in some instances just there. I feel they are just there as a show off. That we can do that, but not in your films. I feel they do play a certain role. So I want to ask you about your approach. What does this tool gives you in terms of, storytelling and staging?
I tend to use wide-angle lenses because I tend to favor as much character as environment, as the context. In some ways, I want the context to be more important than the character. That the context is informing so much about the character and about the thematics of what you're watching. And what I like is how the character of what you're watching is flowing in time, and how, as an audience, you're experimenting that time in real time. I'm not saying that you cannot do that with cuts. You can also achieve that with cuts, but it's not so much for just the mere formal thing of. I'm suspicious of what I call the long shots, the master shots that are like the look mommy no hands, like a show off of virtuosity. They need to have a meaning. Every moment needs to have a meaning. But I feel very comfortable to have done a very long shot and at some point just to break it and go for a cut, if that's what is needed. Mm-hmm. It's not that I'm trying to, and I know that I have the choice to keep on going with one shot, but it's when you said, okay, but it's now just calling attention to itself. It's not so much about getting immersed in the shot.
One last question. Another theme that I see recently in your films or TV series is the theme of the past. When you made Roma, it is very personal, of course, and it touches upon your past, but I think you did it without nostalgia. You did it with softness, with some sensitivity, but with a clear-eyed view. And then, of course, in Disclaimer, there's this very known motif of the past coming back to haunt you. So this is, I think, also something interesting. And coming to Disclaimer, this is a story that I think is also very contemporary in the context of discussions we have today. So can you, just as a last answer, can you elaborate a bit on that?
Well, yes, I mean, I was very intrigued about how we perceive narrative and how we employ narrative. Narrative is the way that we connect with the world. We create stories about, that's how science was created, the evolution of from mythological, religious, and then scientific ideas is about observing and trying to make out a story that explains what you're observing. Now we create narratives about ourselves, our past. We create narratives about the others. People perceive us through narratives. Now the truth of the matter is that all of these narratives, they are leaving certain truths behind, and they tend to be selective narratives. The problem is that that arises in which that narrative can manipulate information, and I think that we're living now more and more in a time in which we are overpopulated by narratives, and narrative, and we have a tendency to give narrative an element of truth, but narrative and truth are not necessarily the same thing. And but a narrative usually is connecting with something that we deeply believe. So that complements like a distorted way, a version of the truth, because in reality you are seeing what you want to believe, know what the truth, even if it's presented in front of you.
Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you very much.